In the cold, isolated forests of Bavaria, during the 18th century, a mystery unfolded that would perplex generations of historians, scientists, and medical professionals alike. It was a secret that remained hidden for years, its truth slowly revealed through the whispers of those who dared to uncover the bizarre tale of an aristocratic family whose bloodline harbored a strange and deadly secret: they could not feel pain. The concept of pain is integral to the human experience, a fundamental response of the body to injury or threat. It serves as both a warning and a mechanism of survival, a signal that something is wrong and needs attention. For the members of this family, however, pain was a foreign sensation. Imagine a world where you could stab yourself with a knife, break a bone, or be scorched by fire without feeling anything. No scream, no flinch, no instinctive retreat. To many, it would seem a gift, a superhuman ability to be impervious to the harsh realities of life. But as the family would soon discover, there is a heavy cost to being unable to feel pain. What appears to be a blessing is, in fact, a curse of the highest order. The family's condition was not one of divine intervention or magical favor. Rather, it was a genetic anomaly, a rare and mysterious inheritance that defied the understanding of those around them. In an era long before the discovery of genetics or DNA, they were unaware of how their family's bloodline had become entangled in such an unusual and dangerous way. Their inability to feel pain was the result of a cruel cycle of inbreeding, practiced by generations of Bavarian aristocrats desperate to preserve their wealth, power, and bloodlines. Inbreeding, a dangerous practice for any population, had led to the rise of numerous genetic disorders throughout history. But for this family, it gave birth to an entirely new and lethal mystery, one that would play out over several generations, leaving behind a dark legacy that would only be understood with the dawn of modern science. At the time, the family's seemingly impervious nature to pain was seen as something extraordinary, even miraculous. Their ability to withstand extreme injuries without so much as a flinch or a cry led many to believe they were touched by some divine force or, conversely, cursed by a malevolent spirit. When news of their condition spread beyond the borders of their estate, it attracted the attention of curious onlookers and terrified medical professionals. How could such a phenomenon be possible? Was it a blessing or a terrifying warning? Those who came into contact with the family were left confused, unsure whether they were witnessing the miracle of human endurance or the horrors of a malfunctioning body. But there were far darker realities hidden beneath the surface. The family's inability to feel pain did not protect them from the ravages of the world. Rather, it exposed them to a slow, silent destruction. Without the natural warning system that pain provides, injuries went unnoticed and untreated. Wounds festered, infections spread, and the body slowly deteriorated from within. This was the hidden cost of their condition, a physical decay that would ultimately prove to be their undoing. The story of this family is not just a tale of genetic misfortune. It is a reflection of the dangers of unchecked power and the consequences of ignoring the natural limits of the human body. At the height of their power, the family was admired for their wealth, influence, and apparent invulnerability. But behind the facade of strength lay a deepening tragedy, one that would ultimately consume them from the inside out. Their story is one of isolation, suffering, and the dangers of ignoring the biological laws that govern us all. As we delve deeper into their story, we will explore the historical, cultural, and medical context of their condition. We will uncover the strange and fascinating ways in which this family's painlessness was perceived by their contemporaries, and how it was both a source of fascination and terror. We will also examine the tragic consequences of their genetic inheritance, and how their inability to feel pain led them down a path of destruction that they could neither avoid nor comprehend. The legacy of this family's strange condition raises difficult questions about the nature of human suffering, the price of genetic purity, and the limits of science and medicine. How did a family so deeply embedded in the aristocracy, so rich and powerful, end up cursed by a genetic flaw that no one understood? And what can we learn from their story that might shed light on the dark corners of human biology? This is a tale that has been lost to time, overshadowed by other more prominent historical events. Yet, it remains one of the most intriguing and unsettling mysteries of the human condition. The inability to feel pain may seem like an anomaly, an outlier in the story of human evolution. But in reality, it is a powerful reminder of how fragile our bodies are and how vulnerable we are to the genetic forces that shape us. Through the story of this family, we will explore the ways in which the human body can be both a vessel of extraordinary strength and a fragile shell susceptible to hidden, unseen forces. For those who dare to look closer, the story of this inbred dynasty holds a mirror up to the limits of human endurance, the ethics of inbreeding, and the terrifying reality of living in a world where the body betrays its own natural instincts. As we uncover the details of their strange, pain-free lives, we will begin to understand that what they endured was far worse than any physical pain, an emotional, psychological, and genetic torment that ultimately proved their undoing. In a world where so much of our experience is shaped by our ability to feel, their story serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes, the most painful thing of all is not feeling anything at all. So, what does it mean to be truly invulnerable? Is it a gift, or is it a curse that leaves us vulnerable in ways we can't even begin to comprehend? The story of the Bavarian dynasty that couldn't feel pain may hold the answer, and in uncovering it, we are left with a haunting question. How much would we be willing to sacrifice for invulnerability, and is it worth it in the end? Bavaria, in the 18th century, was a land of contrasts. Its stunning forests and majestic castles concealed a society marked by strict social hierarchies and a fierce commitment to preserving family bloodlines. The ruling class, deeply entrenched in aristocracy, clung to old traditions, and the concept of lineage was paramount. For the nobility, the preservation of wealth, power, and influence was tied directly to the purity of their bloodlines. Marriages were often strategic, made not for love but to maintain political alliances, secure wealth, and ensure the continuity of the family name. But this obsessive fixation on bloodline purity would come at a great cost for one family, whose practices of inbreeding would give rise to a genetic anomaly that defied the natural order, the inability to feel pain. At the heart of this story lies a family whose name, though not widely remembered today, once echoed through the halls of the Bavarian court. They were aristocrats, their wealth vast and their power significant. The family's estate was a sprawling complex, filled with grand chambers and lush gardens, a symbol of the family's place in society. They lived in an age where lineage and inheritance were considered sacred, a vital component of one's identity. In this world, family was everything, and blood was the most precious thing to safeguard. Marriage among the aristocracy was, to put it bluntly, a business transaction. The decision to marry was rarely based on affection, but rather on maintaining political influence or consolidating wealth. The bloodlines of noble families were seen as a currency more valuable than gold. To ensure the continuity of their power, the noble families of Europe frequently arranged marriages within their own ranks, keeping the bloodline pure and uncontaminated by outsiders. Such unions were designed to prevent the dilution of inherited wealth and status, but they also introduced significant genetic risks that would go unnoticed for generations. This family, like many others, adhered to this practice, marrying cousins, uncles to nieces, and brothers to sisters. At first, these unions appeared to be successful, strengthening their position in the realm and producing heirs that carried on the family name. But beneath the surface, something was brewing, something that no one could have predicted. The consequences of these marriages, this obsessive commitment to blood purity, would eventually reveal themselves in a most startling and disturbing way. For generations, this family's insistence on inbreeding had slowly created a toxic genetic environment, with recessive genes lurking in the family's shared DNA. It was an environment ripe for mutations, small, unseen changes in the genetic code that could go unnoticed for years. And so, it happened. The family produced offspring who, while outwardly healthy and strong, carried within them a mutation that would change the course of their legacy forever, a genetic condition that would make them incapable of feeling physical pain. At the time, such a condition was unfathomable. The idea that a person could survive an injury, no matter how severe, without feeling any pain seemed like a supernatural impossibility. Pain, after all, was universally understood as the body's alarm system, a crucial warning that something was wrong. It was an essential part of the human experience, a primal instinct that protected individuals from harm. Yet, in this family, it was absent, a blank space in the biological blueprint that defined them. The family did not realize immediately that their bloodline was responsible for this anomaly. In fact, their first experiences with pain and sensitivity were more perplexing than alarming. The first signs came in the form of inexplicable accidents. Children would fall, break bones, and yet show no sign of distress. Young adults would suffer horrific injuries, lacerations, burns, even fractures, and yet remain stoic, without so much as a flinch. Initially, these incidents were seen as strange quirks, oddities that could be brushed aside or attributed to some unknown strength. However, as the family's condition persisted across generations, the inexplicable became undeniable. The members of this family could not feel pain. It was as if their bodies had been altered, as though they were immune to one of the most basic human experiences. While other families might have been horrified by such a strange occurrence, the aristocratic family was initially fascinated by it. To them, it was a sign of superior strength, a blessing. Surely, this was a gift that set them apart from the ordinary masses. In their eyes, their ability to withstand injury without so much as a grimace was something to be proud of. It made them feel invincible, above the petty sufferings of common folk. They believed they had been touched by some divine force, an invisible armor that shielded them from the frailties of the human body. But as the generations passed, the true nature of their condition began to reveal itself, not as a gift, but as a curse. Without the vital feedback of pain, members of the family became susceptible to grave injury without ever realizing it. An open wound might go unnoticed until it became infected, a broken bone left untreated until it deformed the body. Without pain, they lacked the instinct to stop what they were doing when harm was near, to retreat from danger or seek medical help. They would keep moving through the world, unaware of the damage they were causing to their bodies. It was an insidious flaw, one that crept slowly, almost imperceptibly, into their lives. The lack of pain didn't just affect their bodies, it affected their entire way of life. Their once pristine image of invincibility was shattered as their health began to deteriorate. And yet, no one could connect the dots between the lack of pain and the growing number of physical problems that plagued them. Without pain, their bodies were slowly rotting, but they could not feel it. This lack of awareness led to further tragedy. Children were born with deformities or suffered from complications that would have been easily avoidable in normal circumstances. Without pain to signal danger, infections took hold, wounds festered, and limbs became disfigured. Despite the family's wealth and access to the finest doctors of the time, their condition was misunderstood and misdiagnosed. The medical community, still in the early stages of understanding genetics, could offer little more than bewilderment. There were no answers, only confusion and growing fear. The family had no idea how to stop the cycle, nor did they understand the cause of their condition. They continued to marry within the family, believing that their bloodline was simply cursed. Yet, inbreeding continued to spread the genetic flaw, compounding the tragedy with each new generation. The family's history is one of a deep, unsettling irony. What began as an effort to maintain their legacy, keeping their bloodline pure, untainted by outsiders, ended in the creation of a new generation cursed by their own blood. In their attempt to control their future through inbreeding, they unwittingly set in motion a tragedy that would ultimately destroy them. Their obsession with blood purity, with maintaining the family name at all costs, led them to overlook the dangers of genetic defects, a flaw that would claim the lives of many of their descendants and extinguish the family line. The story of this family is a chilling reminder of the unexpected consequences of inbreeding, and the ways in which an obsession with purity can blind individuals to the dangers hidden beneath the surface. What started as a desire for strength, for continuity, for invulnerability, led to the slow, painful collapse of an entire bloodline. Their story is not one of divine favor but of human folly, the kind of tragedy that unfolds when the forces of nature are ignored, and the consequences are felt far too late. Over the centuries, human history has borne witness to countless cases of genetic anomalies, some of which were recognized in their time, while others remained hidden, lost in the fog of history. The case of this family, however, stands out not just because of the rarity of their condition, but because of the sheer scope of its impact on their lives. The story of how this family's inability to feel pain was passed down through generations is an eerie reflection of the ways in which genetics, once set in motion, can profoundly shape the course of an entire lineage. To truly understand how this condition came to be, we need to delve deeper into the science of genetics, an area still in its infancy during the 18th century, yet one that would eventually offer explanations for the seemingly inexplicable phenomena that defined this family. The family's inability to feel pain was not the result of a single, random mutation but the culmination of generations of inbreeding, each generation unknowingly passing along a harmful genetic mutation that altered the family's physiological makeup in unimaginable ways. Inbreeding, the act of marrying within one's family or closely related individuals, was a common practice among the European aristocracy, particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries. The reasons for such unions were rooted in both political and economic motives. Marrying within the family was seen as a way to preserve wealth, consolidate power, and protect family lineage from external influences. In an age where alliances and political control were often determined by blood, maintaining a pure lineage was considered paramount. In the case of this particular Bavarian family, these marriages were strategically arranged to ensure the family's wealth and status remained intact. However, The very practice that was meant to preserve the family's power and fortune was, in fact, the breeding ground for a genetic flaw that would haunt them for generations. Each marriage between closely related family members increased the likelihood of recessive genes being passed down and expressed in the offspring. These recessive genes, inherited from both sides of the family, were harmless when they appeared in isolation but became problematic when inherited in pairs. The genetic defect that led to the family's inability to feel pain was one such recessive gene. In the early generations of this family, the symptoms of this condition went unnoticed. Children were born seemingly healthy, with no apparent signs of any physical abnormalities. But as the generations progressed, subtle differences began to emerge. Members of the family would often suffer from inexplicable injuries that went unnoticed, accidents that should have caused severe pain but instead left the victims unfazed. As time went on, the condition became more pronounced, and it became clear that something was wrong, something far beyond mere clumsiness or fortuitous luck. Medical professionals at the time, lacking the knowledge of genetics that we possess today, were baffled by the family's condition. To them, it seemed as though the family had been blessed, perhaps even chosen by divine forces, to live without the affliction of pain. But as the family continued to suffer, it became increasingly evident that what they perceived as a gift was, in fact, a curse. The lack of pain was not a mark of divine favor, but a sign of something far more dangerous, a biological anomaly that, left unchecked, would lead to their physical and emotional deterioration. To understand why pain insensitivity was so catastrophic for the family, it is essential to grasp the critical role that pain plays in human physiology. Pain is not just an unpleasant sensation. It is a vital warning system that helps protect the body from harm. When we experience pain, our bodies are alerting us to a problem, whether it's a wound, an illness, or an injury. This feedback mechanism prompts us to take action, whether by stopping an activity, seeking medical attention, or simply moving away from danger. Pain, in this sense, is an essential survival tool. For this family, however, that survival tool was entirely absent. Without the sensation of pain, they were unable to recognize when their bodies were in distress. Injuries that would have been immediately obvious to others, cuts, bruises, fractures, burns, went unnoticed. Wounds that could have been treated promptly became infected, leading to long-term health issues and, in some cases, life-threatening complications. Infections spread unchecked because there was no pain to prompt them to stop, clean the wound, or seek medical care. Broken bones went untreated, leading to deformities and disability. And as the family grew older, the cumulative effects of their condition became increasingly apparent. What made matters worse was the lack of understanding among the medical professionals of the time. They did not have the tools to diagnose genetic disorders or to understand the complex inheritance patterns at play. Instead, they relied on theories that ranged from supernatural explanations to crude, inaccurate medical practices. Some doctors speculated that the family was cursed, perhaps punished by God for some unknown sin. Others believed that their condition was a result of some divine intervention, a gift of invulnerability. But no one could provide a definitive answer, and even the family's own members remained unaware of the true cause of their suffering. This ignorance created a sense of isolation for the family, further deepening the tragedy of their condition. While other families might have sought medical treatment, this family remained in the dark, their condition misunderstood and their physical decline slow but inevitable. Their status and wealth could not shield them from the consequences of their genetic flaw, nor could their social isolation save them from the damage done to their bodies by a failure to recognize their own vulnerability. As time passed, the condition began to spread further within the family. The family's reliance on inbreeding only compounded the problem. With each new generation, the genetic defect became more entrenched, more pronounced. What had once been a subtle anomaly grew into a crippling condition, one that left the family vulnerable to both the physical and emotional tolls of their painlessness. The emotional toll was perhaps the most profound, as members of the family began to realize that they could not experience the full range of human emotions. Pain, after all, is not just a physical sensation. It is also tied to emotional and psychological processes. The inability to feel pain altered the way these individuals interacted with the world, leaving them disconnected from their own bodies and from the emotional experiences that come with them. For a family that had once prided itself on its strength and invulnerability, the realization that their condition was a curse was a bitter pill to swallow. They had spent so many years believing that their painlessness was a sign of greatness, only to discover that it was the result of a devastating genetic flaw. And as the family members aged and suffered from the long-term effects of their condition, They were left to grapple with the horrifying truth. Their inbreeding had created a dynasty of suffering, and they were powerless to stop it. The legacy of this family's genetic anomaly is a haunting one, a testament to the unpredictable consequences of unchecked inbreeding. What began as a seemingly innocuous desire to preserve power and wealth led to a catastrophic genetic flaw that would shape the lives of multiple generations. Their inability to feel pain, once perceived as a gift, ultimately became their undoing, revealing the dark side of a family's quest to maintain control over their destiny. In the end, the family story is one of hubris and tragedy, a reminder that nature, when tampered with, can produce results that no one can anticipate. As the family's strange condition became more apparent, the consequences of their inability to feel pain began to spiral into something much darker than anyone could have imagined. It started with minor accidents, slight injuries that, to an outsider, would seem like nothing more than the inevitable part of everyday life. But to the family, they were something entirely different. Their response, or rather, their lack of response, was what stood out. A child might trip and fall, scraping their knee on the cobblestones, only to rise without shedding a tear, continuing their play as though nothing had happened. A young adult might stumble while hunting, breaking a leg on the jagged rocks, yet show no sign of distress, walking it off as if nothing was amiss. At first, these were simply perceived as curious quirks, perhaps even enviable traits. After all, who wouldn't want to be impervious to the discomforts of life? It seemed like a gift. No more aching muscles after a long ride, no more worrying about cuts or bruises. The family had been accustomed to seeing themselves as above the ordinary sufferings of humanity, and now they appeared to have found a way to transcend the very vulnerabilities that afflict the masses. Their physical resilience was seen as proof of their superiority, and in a time where strength was so often tied to power, their condition gave them an air of invulnerability. However, what began as minor oddities soon escalated into terrifying patterns that no one could ignore. Injuries that would have incapacitated any normal person went unnoticed. In one particularly harrowing instance, a young heir, while engaged in a spirited game of archery, accidentally released an arrow that struck his hand. To any onlookers, it would have seemed like an emergency, yet the heir displayed no pain, no grimace, not even a flinch. His hand began to bleed profusely, but the young man didn't seem to notice. The blood soaked into his sleeve, but he continued with his day, unaware of the damage being done to his body. It wasn't until hours later, when an attendant noticed the bloodstains and insisted on examining the wound, that it became apparent how serious the injury was. But by then, infection had already set in, and the damage was far more severe than it should have been. Another incident, this one involving a middle-aged family member, was even more harrowing. While riding a horse through the rugged terrain of their estate, he was thrown from his mount. His body crashed into the rocky ground, and he suffered multiple broken ribs, a concussion, and bruising all over. Yet, there was no scream, no cry of distress. When he rose, covered in dirt and blood, there was no sign of pain in his demeanor. To an outsider, he looked like a man untouched by the violent forces that had just struck him down. He continued his journey, unaware of the internal damage he had sustained. It wasn't until the next day, when he began to cough up blood, that his condition was recognized for what it truly was. The damage was immense, but because he had not felt the pain, he hadn't sought immediate medical attention. By the time he received treatment, it was too late. His injuries, left untreated for so long, led to a prolonged and agonizing death. These incidents were not isolated. They were part of a growing pattern of injuries that went unnoticed, resulting in slow, inevitable deterioration. Over time, members of the family began to experience physical consequences that were difficult to ignore. Bones that had gone untreated began to heal improperly, limbs became deformed, and infections ran rampant through their bodies. Yet, without the ability to feel pain, there was no urgency to address the damage. Their bodies were slowly falling apart, but they remained unaware of just how much harm was being done. To complicate matters further, their social isolation meant that their injuries were often left undiagnosed for long periods. While ordinary people could rely on friends, family, or medical professionals to notice when something was wrong, the family was often kept apart from the wider community. Their wealth and status had made them a target of both admiration and fear. The noble family's condition, though strange and unsettling, only added to the air of mystery that surrounded them. They were seen as something almost otherworldly, and not in a compassionate way. People didn't know how to approach them, or what to make of the family's strange resilience to harm. Even the physicians of the time, faced with a bizarre condition that defied all medical understanding, were unsure how to proceed. At first, they were intrigued by the family's apparent strength, but as more incidents of untreated injuries and infections occurred, the doctor's curiosity turned to concern. Yet, they too were stymied by their lack of knowledge. Pain, in the medical world of the 18th century, was understood as a necessary signal for the body's healing process. It told the body when something was wrong, prompting a response to mitigate the injury. The family's lack of pain was a complete anomaly. If pain was a natural protective mechanism, then what did it mean for the family to be unable to experience it? The physicians were powerless to provide answers. Their treatment methods were rudimentary at best, and many of the conditions the family endured went undiagnosed or misdiagnosed entirely. For example, wounds that should have been treated with care became festering sores because the family members had no instinct to stop and address the injury in time. As the condition continued to spread within the family, the physical toll became undeniable. Yet, the members of the family had no understanding of why this was happening. They had long believed that their inability to feel pain was a sign of their superiority, a mark of divinity or strength. Their apparent invulnerability had been a source of pride, something that set them apart from others. But as their health deteriorated, it became increasingly clear that they had misinterpreted the nature of their condition. Far from being a blessing, it was a curse that would gradually consume them. The family's inability to recognize their own vulnerability led to an atmosphere of denial. They continued to believe that their resilience made them immune to the consequences that affected ordinary people. They remained convinced that they were somehow special, untouchable, and immune to the laws that governed the rest of humanity. This denial only delayed their reckoning with the true consequences of their condition. They did not seek medical help as urgently as they should have, for they did not understand the gravity of their situation. Their belief in their own invincibility, which had once been a source of pride, had now become a dangerous hindrance. It wasn't just the physical toll that plagued the family. There was also a deep psychological and emotional cost to living without pain. Pain is not just a biological signal. It is also an emotional and psychological experience. It teaches us empathy, it helps us understand the limitations of our bodies, and it connects us to others in profound ways. The family, however, was cut off from this essential human experience. Without the ability to feel pain, they could not fully connect to the suffering of others. They could not empathize in the way that most people do when they witness someone in distress. This detachment not only isolated them from the outside world but also created a disconnect within the family itself. They could not truly understand each other's experiences, nor could they relate to the lives of those outside their circle. The consequences of their condition extended far beyond the physical and emotional toll. They began to erode the family's sense of humanity. They had become something other than human, a family that could not feel what others felt, a family that could not experience pain. They lived in a world where their own bodies betrayed them, where the absence of pain made them increasingly indifferent to their suffering. And in that indifference, they slowly became disconnected from the very essence of what it meant to be alive. As the family's condition grew more widely known, both within the medical community and beyond, it became a source of intense fascination and fear. To the physicians of the 18th century, the family represented a mystery they could not solve, a medical riddle that defied all logical explanation. In a time when the understanding of human anatomy, genetics, and biology was still in its infancy, the family's inability to feel pain left doctors grasping for answers, some of which were shaped by the superstitions and religious beliefs of the era. The absence of pain was seen as something so unnatural, so outside the boundaries of normal human experience, that it seemed to suggest divine influence, supernatural forces, or a curse. This lack of medical understanding turned what could have been a straightforward diagnosis into an enduring mystery that compounded the family's suffering. At the time, medical practitioners were far from the enlightened experts of today's world. Anatomy was still poorly understood, and while the concept of diseases was beginning to take shape, the knowledge of genetics and inherited traits was non-existent. In this world of primitive medical science, any condition that fell outside the realm of the expected was often categorized as either supernatural or divine. Painlessness, especially when it appeared in the form of an entire family, isolation and physical invulnerability, was an anomaly too strange to be explained by contemporary medicine. Some physicians, unable to comprehend the true nature of the family's condition, resorted to supernatural explanations. They speculated that the family had been cursed, perhaps as a punishment for some ancestral sin. In the deeply religious society of the time, it was not uncommon to see illness or strange behavior as a sign of divine wrath. The idea of a curse was particularly appealing to those who could not accept that such an extraordinary medical phenomenon could exist without some form of divine intervention. Others speculated that the family was protected by some higher force, that they were immune to pain because they had been chosen by God for some special purpose. These ideas were rooted in the religious and philosophical paradigms of the time, where science was often entwined with superstition. At the same time, there were a handful of medical professionals who sought more rational explanations, although they were still working with limited tools and knowledge. Some began to consider the family's strange condition in light of the emerging concept of hereditary diseases. However, the science of genetics had not yet been discovered, so the medical community was still struggling to understand how traits were passed from one generation to the next. The idea of inherited conditions was still in its infancy, and the notion of a genetic mutation was a concept that would not be fully understood for centuries to come. In this context, the family's pain insensitivity was seen as an unfathomable anomaly, a case too bizarre to be fully explained within the medical framework of the time. The medical theories surrounding the family's condition were varied and inconsistent. Some physicians believed that the lack of pain might have been a result of an imbalance in the humors, the prevailing medical theory of the time. According to the humoral theory, health was determined by the balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An imbalance in these humors was believed to cause illness, and some doctors speculated that the family's inability to feel pain was the result of an excess of one of these humors, which could have rendered them immune to the sensations of pain. However, this theory was as unsubstantiated as the supernatural explanations, offering no real understanding of the genetic factors at play. Others considered the possibility of a physical defect in the nervous system. Some believed that the family's pain insensitivity was a result of nerve damage or dysfunction, particularly in the central nervous system, where pain signals are transmitted. These theories, while rooted in an early understanding of anatomy, still lacked the sophistication needed to make a definitive diagnosis. The understanding of the nervous system was rudimentary, and the concept of how pain is processed in the brain was still far beyond the reach of contemporary medical knowledge. As such, the idea that the family had a defect in their nervous system, though plausible in some respects, could not be confirmed with the tools available at the time. This lack of understanding also contributed to the family's own confusion. For them, the absence of pain had initially been a source of pride, seen as a divine gift or a special favor. They could endure physical hardships that would have incapacitated others, and their resilience was often praised by those around them. However, as time passed and the consequences of their condition became more severe, the family began to realize that what they had once believed to be a blessing was, in fact, a terrible curse. They suffered silently, not from the pain of injury, but from the slow and insidious effects of untreated wounds, infections, and bodily harm. As injuries went untreated and infections spread unchecked, the family's health began to decline in ways that could no longer be ignored. Without the instinctive reaction to pain, they failed to address even the most obvious signs of harm. A simple cut, left untreated because there was no pain to signal danger, could turn into a deadly infection. Broken bones went unhealed, and internal injuries went unnoticed until they became life-threatening. The family's inability to feel pain had left them at the mercy of their own bodies, with no natural way of knowing when something was wrong or when they needed help. As the family's condition became more severe, the doctors who attended to them were forced to reckon with the limitations of their medical knowledge. Despite their best efforts, many were unable to offer any meaningful treatment, as they did not understand the underlying cause of the condition. Even when the family sought medical help, it often came too late. Their injuries had festered and worsened in the absence of pain, and by the time they sought help, it was often beyond the point of recovery. The family was trapped in a vicious cycle. They couldn't feel the damage being done to their bodies, and the medical professionals were unable to diagnose or treat the condition effectively. The idea of superhuman resistance to pain became a source of myth and folklore surrounding the family. In some circles, the family was seen as something other than human, their condition both awe-inspiring and terrifying. They became a subject of curiosity, but also a warning, an example of how the human body could be altered by forces beyond its control. People whispered that the family's inability to feel pain had made them colder, more detached from the human experience, as if their lack of sensation had numbed their ability to empathize with others. They were viewed as outsiders, their condition marking them as fundamentally different from the rest of society. But the medical community, though perplexed, was not entirely without its own theories. Some began to think that the family's lack of pain might be a form of evolutionary adaptation, a trait that had somehow been preserved within their bloodline. In a society where survival was often linked to strength and resilience, it was not unimaginable that such a trait might have once been viewed as advantageous. Perhaps the family's ancestors had been warriors or hunters, and the inability to feel pain had allowed them to endure the rigors of combat or battle. The idea of pain insensitivity as a survival mechanism, though speculative at the time, would later gain traction in modern medical research when genetic mutations linked to congenital insensitivity to pain were discovered. As the years passed, and the family's health continued to deteriorate, the search for answers continued. Yet, the true nature of their condition, the genetic mutation that caused their inability to feel pain, remained elusive. It would take centuries before the discovery of genetic science and the study of mutations would provide the answers the family so desperately needed. In the meantime, they continued to live their lives in isolation, caught between the myths of their time and the medical ignorance that surrounded them. This tragic tale of the family's pain insensitivity serves as a reminder of how, in the absence of scientific understanding, human beings often turn to superstition, myth, and fear. It also underscores the fragility of human health, and how even the most seemingly invincible bodies can be vulnerable in ways that defy comprehension. While their condition may have made them immune to one of the most basic sensations of human existence, it ultimately led them down a path of destruction, one that could have been avoided with the right understanding and treatment. As the family's strange and tragic condition continued to unfold, the consequences of their inability to feel pain began to reach their peak, casting a shadow over their once prominent status in Bavarian society. What had initially been regarded as an extraordinary blessing, a sign of superior strength and invulnerability, gradually transformed into an overwhelming curse that eroded the family from within. Despite their wealth, power, and high social standing, the family found themselves unable to escape the devastating repercussions of their genetic anomaly. In the face of slow decay, physical disfigurement, and eventual death, the family began to unravel, not just in body, but in spirit. Their isolation, both social and physical, became more pronounced. While other noble families still engaged in the political and social affairs of the kingdom, this family withdrew more and more from the world. Their strange condition, which was not fully understood by those around them, made them an object of fear, superstition, and fascination. Their inability to feel pain, once thought of as an enviable trait, now made them seem almost otherworldly, and not in a way that invited admiration. As rumors spread about their strange lives and unexplainable condition, they became the subject of whispers, gossip, and cautious avoidance. The aristocracy, once eager to flaunt their wealth and privilege, now recoiled at the idea of associating with a family marked by a mysterious, and perhaps cursed, ailment. The family's physical condition continued to deteriorate at an alarming rate. With each passing year, more members succumbed to the ravages of their inability to feel pain. Wounds that would have been immediately addressed in any other family went untreated, leading to infections that spread unchecked. An injured child, who might have cried out for help, simply carried on playing, unaware of the severity of their wounds. An elderly relative, suffering from a fall, might not have felt the broken bones or bruises until it was too late, resulting in gangrene or the gradual breakdown of tissue. The painlessness that should have been their salvation instead became their downfall. The family's insensitivity to pain allowed them to keep functioning, but it also allowed injuries to progress without proper care, leading to long-term complications that compounded with each passing generation. At first, medical professionals and even family members themselves were hopeful that the situation might improve, or that someone might eventually find a way to cure the condition. But as the years wore on, it became increasingly clear that there was no simple solution. The family's fate seemed sealed, and the medical community's failure to identify or treat the underlying cause of their suffering left them in a state of suspended agony, trapped in a cycle of decay and deterioration without the natural means of detecting or reversing the damage. It was not just their physical bodies that suffered. The family's inability to feel pain also took an emotional toll. Pain, though unpleasant, is integral to the human experience. It connects us to our own bodies and to others. It fosters empathy, compassion, and understanding. It teaches us the limits of our own strength and endurance. Without pain, the family members began to lose touch with these essential aspects of human existence. The emotional disconnect between the family members and the world around them grew more pronounced with each passing day. They no longer experienced the same responses to suffering that others did. A simple scraped knee or an aching muscle, which would have sent anyone else into a temporary fit of discomfort, had no meaning for them. They lived in a state of numbness that extended far beyond the physical. And as the family's condition continued to worsen, so too did their internal relationships. When the body is in pain, it often seeks comfort and connection. But for this family, their condition led them into a state of isolation not only from society but from each other. The shared experiences of suffering that might normally bind family members together were absent. There was no physical expression of empathy, no gentle touch to soothe a wound, no comforting words in the wake of an injury, no shared understanding of what it was like to feel hurt. Each family member's internal world was fundamentally different from everyone else's, and as a result, there was an emotional chasm between them. They could no longer truly relate to the suffering of others, nor could they understand the suffering they themselves were enduring. This isolation became a source of growing frustration for many family members. They had been raised in a world where family bonds were considered sacred, where bloodlines were preserved and nurtured for the greater good of the family legacy. But now, these very bonds seemed to be fraying. The lack of emotional and physical connection between the family members themselves created an atmosphere of detachment, an inability to connect not only with the outside world but with each other. They were trapped in their own experiences of painlessness, cut off from the normal human connections that would have otherwise given them solace. In addition to their physical and emotional isolation, the family's legacy was increasingly threatened by the passage of time. As generations continued to be born into the family, the genetic condition persisted and even worsened. With each new generation, the family's internal decay became more pronounced. What had once been a rare anomaly became a curse that was deeply embedded in the family's bloodline. The family's attempts to continue their once glorious legacy of wealth and power were thwarted by the unrelenting toll of their own condition. The curse that had initially seemed like a gift had now become a death sentence, eroding the very foundation upon which the family had built their name. Attempts to find answers or solutions to the family's condition were largely fruitless. Without a true understanding of genetics, the family's condition remained a medical mystery that even the most learned doctors could not solve. While some suspected that the family's insensitivity to pain was a result of nerve damage, no one could pinpoint the exact cause. Others posited that their condition was a result of a unique mutation passed down through the generations, but again, this was mere speculation. The family, meanwhile, had no understanding of the genetic forces at work. They continued to marry within the family, hoping that somehow this practice would strengthen their bloodline. But in reality, it only deepened the tragedy, further embedding the mutation that caused their painlessness into the next generation. The family's eventual decline was both physical and spiritual. As the members of the family grew older, they began to reflect on their lives and the legacy they had hoped to leave behind. What had once been a symbol of pride, an aristocratic family with power, wealth, and a seemingly invulnerable bloodline, had become a symbol of hubris and folly. Their isolation, their inability to feel pain, and their growing disillusionment with their own condition left them with nothing but regret. What had they gained from their obsession with blood purity, from their insistence on preserving their name and their family wealth at all costs? What had been the point of all the suffering they had endured, if it had only led them to a life of isolation and slow decline? The final generations of the family, frail and broken, looked upon the ruins of their legacy with a deep sense of loss. There was no triumph to be had, no victory over adversity. Instead, the family story became one of quiet tragedy, of the slow erosion of a once great name. They had lived in a world where pain was absent, but in the end, it was the absence of pain that caused them to lose everything. The very thing that had been a source of pride, an inability to feel pain, had ultimately brought about their undoing. And as they watched their bloodline slowly fade into nothing, they were left with nothing but the bitter realization that, in the end, they had paid the highest price for their own ignorance and arrogance. As the years wore on and the family's tragic condition progressed, the consequences of their inability to feel pain continued to unfold, shaping their fate in increasingly dire ways. The family, once revered for its wealth and ability, had now become a mere shadow of its former self. The legacy they had worked so hard to preserve through generations of strategic marriages, social maneuvering, and political alliances was crumbling, piece by piece. The strange affliction that had been a source of pride in their early years had now become their greatest burden, and it was clear that the family could no longer escape the inevitable consequences of their actions. By this time, the family's medical situation had reached a point of critical importance. The absence of pain, which had seemed like a gift in the early years, had now revealed itself as a relentless force of destruction. Physical injuries, once trivial and inconsequential, now took on life-threatening proportions. A scratch that would have healed on its own became an open wound that festered and spread infection. Broken bones went unnoticed, left to heal improperly and causing permanent deformities. Internal injuries went undiagnosed, and organs began to fail. As each generation passed, the damage became more extensive, and what had started as a simple genetic anomaly now had life-threatening implications. The family's inability to feel pain did not just harm them physically, it also stripped away their humanity in a deeper, more profound way. Pain, though unpleasant, is an integral part of the human experience. It connects people to their own bodies and to each other. It elicits empathy and understanding, allowing individuals to recognize and respond to the suffering of others. In the absence of pain, the family members were cut off from this essential human connection. They no longer understood what it meant to suffer, either in themselves or in others. They were emotionally detached, unable to form the bonds of compassion and empathy that are so crucial to the human experience. This emotional numbness extended far beyond the family's immediate circle. As their condition worsened, the family became more reclusive, withdrawing from society even further. Their once vibrant social life had dwindled into a hushed existence. No longer able to engage in the world with the same energy and optimism they once had, the family's members retreated into the confines of their estate, where their isolation deepened. Their condition was no longer something to be flaunted with pride. It had become a source of shame and despair. The aristocratic veneer that had once shielded them from the harsh realities of life was now cracking, and the true cost of their isolation was beginning to take its toll. In many ways, the family's physical decline mirrored the collapse of their social standing. Once powerful and influential, they had now become the subject of whispers and scorn. Their inability to feel pain had made them appear cold and unfeeling, even monstrous, to those around them. The same people who had once admired their wealth and grace now saw them as tragic figures, outcasts, living in a world where they were no longer welcome. The family's reputation, once one of grandeur and power, had been replaced by pity and fear. Those who once sought their favor now avoided them, too uneasy to face the family's strange affliction. The nobility, which had once celebrated the family's achievements, began to distance themselves from them, unsure of how to navigate the social and political consequences of their condition. The family's inability to feel pain, though still shrouded in mystery, had become something far more sinister in the eyes of their peers. It was no longer just an oddity, it was a mark of divine wrath, or worse, an irreversible flaw that tainted their very bloodline. They were no longer seen as powerful rulers of their estates, but as living reminders of the fragility of the human body and the unpredictable consequences of inbreeding. The family, once so proud of their ability to withstand injury and hardship, now found themselves vulnerable in ways they could not have imagined. Their inability to seek proper medical help, due to both their own denial and the lack of understanding from the medical professionals of the time, had led to irreversible physical damage. They could not feel the pain of their wounds, and so they failed to take the necessary steps to treat them before it was too late. Infections ravaged their bodies, bones healed crookedly, and organs slowly began to fail. Even their minds, once sharp and focused, began to deteriorate, as they suffered from the long-term consequences of their untreated injuries. For the remaining family members, life became a cycle of suffering and decline. The once pristine halls of their estate, which had once echoed with laughter and conversation, now stood empty, echoing only with the sounds of silent mourning. Their family had become a pale shadow of the proud dynasty it had once been. The very thing that had allowed them to endure hardships, an inability to feel pain, had become the force that slowly led them to their demise. In their final years, the family members began to grapple with the full weight of their condition. They realized, too late, the gravity of the curse they had inherited. Painlessness, which they had once seen as a divine gift, now seemed like an ironic punishment. In the absence of pain, they had lost their ability to protect themselves. They had been too proud to seek help, too blind to understand the implications of their condition. And now, as they watched their bodies wither away, they were forced to confront the reality of their genetic flaw. What began as an inheritance of power and influence, an aristocratic dynasty built on the strength of their bloodline, had become a tragic legacy of loss and decay. The family's obsession with maintaining their blood purity, a practice born from the desire to protect their wealth and status, had ultimately led to their downfall. By marrying within their own ranks for generations, they had passed down a dangerous genetic mutation, a flaw that now consumed them. They had sought to preserve their power through inbreeding, but instead, they had sealed their own fate. In their final days, as the family members looked back on their lives, they must have felt a profound sense of regret. What had they achieved through their relentless pursuit of blood purity? What had their family legacy amounted to, if it had only led to this slow, painful unraveling? The wealth, the power, the title, none of it mattered anymore. It could not save them from the devastation of their own genetics. They had built their name on the belief that they could control their future, but in the end, their future had been determined by the very blood that coursed through their veins. The curse that they had inherited was not one that could be broken by wealth or status. It was a biological curse, one that no amount of money or influence could undo. The tragic irony of the family story is that they had unwittingly created their own demise. Their attempts to ensure the continuity of their name and their power had blinded them to the risks of inbreeding, risks that would eventually manifest in the form of a genetic flaw so profound that it would lead to their physical and emotional collapse. The family's condition, the inability to feel pain, was not a gift, as they had once believed, but a cruel reminder of the fragility of life and the unpredictable consequences of tampering with the very building blocks of human existence. In the end, the family's legacy was not one of triumph or power, but one of tragedy and loss. Their name, once synonymous with strength and invulnerability, would fade into obscurity, remembered only as a cautionary tale of the dangers of inbreeding and the unpredictable nature of genetics. Their story serves as a stark reminder that even the most seemingly invincible families, no matter how powerful or wealthy, can be brought to their knees by forces beyond their control. What began as an attempt to preserve their bloodline and their legacy ended in the complete dissolution of both. The family's inability to feel pain was, in the end, a symbol not of divine favor, but of the devastating consequences of pride, ignorance, and the relentless pursuit of an ideal that was ultimately their undoing. As the family's decline continued, the once grand estate that had symbolized their power and prestige stood as a silent witness to their unraveling. Its sprawling halls, once filled with lively banter and the sounds of music and celebration, were now eerily quiet. The vast chambers, adorned with expensive tapestries and priceless antiques, seemed to absorb the sorrow and confusion that permeated the air. The family's members, those few who remained, spent their days in near total seclusion, retreating further from society as they battled the physical and emotional consequences of their condition. Though their affliction was still not understood by the outside world, it was clear that the family's fate had already been sealed, both by the ravages of time and the irreversible toll of their genetic curse. The lack of pain had left them vulnerable in ways that could never have been foreseen. Wounds that went unnoticed festered into deadly infections. Fractures that should have been tended to were left untreated, leading to crippling deformities. Internally, the body slowly deteriorated, organs failed without warning, and their once vibrant bodies slowly withered away from within. The family's inability to experience pain had robbed them of the vital cues that would have prompted immediate action. What could have been small, manageable injuries had turned into life-threatening conditions. Simple falls had led to life-altering consequences, with some family members suffering irreversible damage to their joints and limbs, while others experienced organ failure from untreated internal injuries. But even more devastating than the physical deterioration was the emotional and psychological toll. Pain, as much as it is a source of suffering, also plays a vital role in human empathy and connection. When someone is hurt, whether physically or emotionally, pain allows them to bond with others, to share in the experience of suffering. It's a fundamental part of the human condition, and without it, the family became more and more detached from those around them. The inability to feel pain created a chasm between them and the rest of society, and it also isolated them from each other. It became apparent that their condition did not just cause them to be physically detached from the world, it severed the very emotional connections that should have bound them together. As time passed, the family's internal relationships began to fray. The once tightly knit bond that had existed between family members was now fraying, as they struggled to understand their own suffering and that of others. With no shared experience of pain, there was no common ground for connection. The family's emotional lives became increasingly hollow, and the love and affection that had once been a hallmark of their relationships gradually gave way to a cold, sterile atmosphere of detachment. It wasn't just that they couldn't empathize with others, but they also couldn't empathize with themselves. Without pain as a signal, they became oblivious to their own vulnerabilities, their own weaknesses, and the very essence of what made them human. Their emotional numbness mirrored the physical toll of their condition. The lack of pain was both their curse and their prison. It allowed them to survive in the face of injuries that would have been fatal to others, but it also prevented them from taking the necessary precautions to protect themselves. In their denial, they persisted in a cycle of self-destruction, unaware of how far gone they were until it was too late. They were like passengers aboard a sinking ship, unaware of the disaster unfolding beneath their feet. And with each passing day, their strength and resilience, which had once been their greatest asset, became their greatest liability. Outside the family's walls, rumors continued to spread. The strange nature of their condition, the rumors of their invulnerability, and the inexplicable suffering that seemed to follow them made them the subject of fear and fascination. People were drawn to the idea that there existed a family so powerful, so beyond the ordinary laws of nature, that they could live without pain. But it was a fascination tinged with fear. The family, who had once been symbols of power, wealth, and privilege, were now seen as tragic, broken beings, a warning to anyone who might dare to challenge the natural order of things. The more isolated the family became, the more they became an object of both pity and horror. They were the last remnants of a dynasty that had outlived its usefulness, a once mighty house that had been undone by its own genetic legacy. The family's decline also drew the attention of outsiders, doctors, physicians, and scholars from various parts of Europe, all eager to study this bizarre affliction. But with each new arrival, the family only became more and more withdrawn. They were too far gone to be of any use as test subjects, and their condition was already so advanced that no physician could offer any meaningful treatment. The few doctors who came to visit were left in awe of the family's strange resilience, but their fascination was never enough to bring any true healing. The family, locked in their isolation, was beyond the reach of the medical professionals who would have otherwise attempted to help. They had become living relics of a past that was no longer relevant in the present. As the family's condition worsened, their once grand estate began to fall into disrepair. The estate, which had once been the center of their social and political life, now stood abandoned and decaying. The family's wealth and titles could no longer shield them from the passage of time or the consequences of their genetic flaw. The walls of the estate, once filled with the laughter of the family and the sounds of celebrations, were now silent. The echoes of a bygone era seemed to haunt the halls as the family members, one by one, withered away. Their once proud legacy was slipping into obscurity, a forgotten chapter in the history of Bavarian nobility. The estate became a metaphor for the family's own decline, once majestic and filled with life, now a hollow shell of its former self. The grand rooms, now empty of guests, were filled with shadows, and the beautiful gardens that had once been tended with care were now overgrown and untamed. The family's once glorious name, once synonymous with power and influence, was now a faded memory, its legacy crumbling like the walls of their home. What had once been a dynasty that commanded respect was now a family living in silent desperation, unable to comprehend the full extent of their fall from grace. In their final days, the family members must have come to understand the full weight of their condition. The absence of pain, which they had once celebrated, had led them down a path of destruction. They had been unable to feel the pain that might have saved them, the pain that would have prompted them to seek help, to take action, to save themselves. But it was too late for them. They had lived in denial for so long, believing their invulnerability to be a sign of their superiority, that they had failed to recognize the true nature of their affliction until it was beyond their control. As they passed from this world, the family's name became a cautionary tale, a warning to future generations about the dangers of inbreeding and the unpredictability of genetic inheritance. The tragic story of their demise serves as a stark reminder of the fragile nature of human existence, and the ways in which even the most seemingly invulnerable families can be undone by the very forces they thought they could control. The family, once at the pinnacle of power and prestige, had been brought to ruin by the consequences of their own genetics, a legacy of hubris that would forever haunt the pages of history. Their story remains a chilling reminder that even the most powerful families can be destroyed by the unseen forces of biology and fate.